Today I'll be talking a little bit about Walt Whitman. You've got some work to do on him in the discussion. It's definitely going to be helpful to have some background on him. Other thing you might notice if you took 75A with me, I had a different slide background. I chose this one for 75B because it gave it like that old, like cinematic, photographic look of early 20th century, late 19th century. If it's not the best way to look at things on your screen, let me know and I'll change it to something else. Well, now that we got the important stuff out of the way, Walt Whitman, I had you read Song of Myself. Now, SIFT is an excellent technique to use for this extended poem, but you'll probably notice that in some ways, it's a poem that reads like no other. So let's talk about it a little bit. A little bit of background information. He worked in Brooklyn and Manhattan as a journalist. Remember, that's a very common, early career or side career or even main career for a lot of the writers we're going to see in this class. Helps pay the bills, but also gives them a chance to really dig deep and learn more about the emerging nation that they are writing about. And he was also a worker and an advocate for the Free Soil Party, which was a political party and activist organization that basically believed that no state should be admitted to the Union that would allow slavery. And of course, this is something that happens. This is something that's really important before the Civil War. After the Civil War, it's a moot point, at least on paper. Clearly, there's still huge problems with, the way African Americans are treated during this period. He also worked as a hospital attendant in the Civil War. And if you've read portions of Drum Taps, you'll certainly notice that. Another important thing to notice about that is that Drum Taps has a very kind of traditional rouse or clarion call to the just war feeling and tone to it. It's hopeful, it's righteous. He saw some terrible, terrible things in those field hospitals during the Civil War. The increased carnage made possible by advances in military technology decimated Americans left and right and left them wounded and in terrible, terrible shape. The leadership of both militaries had no idea how to deploy these new technologies well, and often sent hundreds, thousands of troops to the slaughter because they didn't understand what was happening and what was new. If you really want to know more about the Civil War, and I know you do, check out the Ken Burns series from PBS on the Civil War. Fantastic 8-part series, I think. It may be on one of your streaming services. I bet you can find it on Netflix too. Excellent background information for this course. And boy, oh boy, like I'm asking you to do in your discussion, I want you to think about the way in which his poetic standards are different from others. What seems new about him? In what ways is his poetry a whole new way of looking at things and a whole way of writing about things? Well, he writes about nature and the human spirit, but he also talks about the human body and sexuality. And this is very, very new. He talks about how no part of him is dirty or sacrilegious. So he's completely shunning the shame that is very traditional in Western religion, where the body is a point of corruption and decadence and vice. He's saying it's wonderful. Having a body is great. Expressing love is great. The other part of sexuality that is really important, there are a couple more. One is that he shows women as agents of desire. Many of you will remember the section 11, I believe, where it's a woman peering through her window shades to see young men bathing in a pond near her house. And she's a widow because she's an old maid because she's like 28. But he writes it in such a way to show that she is looking at them and she finds them desirous and attractive. She is a woman with agency. She's not just a sexual object, but a sexual subject. And this is revolutionary. That women have any idea about sexuality other than duty, at least in men's minds, is completely off the charts, and it was considered obscene. He also makes references to homosexuality and bisexuality. Most scholarship probably leans to the side that he was bisexual, and that too was considered obscene during his day. And he creates the most popular poetic form in the 20th and 21st centuries, poetic verse. I mean, a free verse. Free verse means there's no meter. In other words, there is no regular rhythm in each line. He just goes as long as he wants and then he cuts it. And there is no regular rhyme scheme. That is not to say that there isn't any art in his lines or that he is not using poetic structures in some ways, but it definitely doesn't read like a traditional poem. Now, the first time you go through and read Song of Myself, you're going to be like, whoa, what's going on? He's talking about grass. Grass is the flag. Grass is, the handkerchief that nature left for God. Now he's talking about, a firefighter dying in a fire, and about people dying in war. And now he's talking about somebody going off to be hanged. And now he's talking about, a prisoner contracting syphilis. His job is to encompass all of humanity and to erase boundaries. Notice he's not judging. He's putting that kind of assumption aside. So he's really coming out of this transcendentalist worldview that we saw in 75A. And I'm going to need to talk a little bit more about that for people who haven't taken 75A, just so they understand it. But in a very, very, very quick nutshell, transcendentalism is this philosophical and spiritual movement started by Ralph Waldo Emerson and picked up by many other writers in America that considers human beings to be divine and all of nature to be divine. That doesn't mean that they're without flaw or without sin, but that there is great potential in human beings through their individual ideas and their intuitions and their instincts. Subjective reality put forward through artistic and emotional expression is really what's at the core. If there were rules to be followed, they thought, hey, those rules might be good for you and your universe, but I myself am my own universe. I fit into the God web in my own way. And there are even points where Whitman talks about his relationship to God, and he compares himself to all kinds of different deities, and not in a dismissive, this God is right, these gods are wrong, they're garbage, they're heretical. He's saying he's part of all of them, that he's part of Allah, he's part of Jehovah, he's part of Buddha, he is part of Vishnu, he is part of Quetzalcoatl, he is part of Zeus, he is part of Odin, and all of these traditions saying that there is something in them for everyone, and that he himself is more than all of these things, and that we ourselves are more than all of these things. So it's a very inclusive spiritual hug to the entire universe. Now, given the way he talked about nature and human spirit and the human body, and also the way he threw away the conventions of meter and rhyme, he helps to rebuild poetry in a way that it's about something for everybody. that it's about people who work. It's about everyday people. It doesn't have to be people who went to higher education, which was extremely rare back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was for everyone. Um, and this has really helped democratize poetry as we know it now in the 20th and 21st century. Most people who don't like poetry because they felt burned or like they couldn't understand it because of some certain kinds of poets in the past. But you know what? You find a person who hates poetry, I can find them a poem they'll like. Okay, that's my big selling point. Let's keep going on there. How are we doing for time? That looks like I got it. Okay, let's keep going. So, Leaves of Grass in 1855 catapults him into literary fame. Like I said before, it was popularly derided as obscenity, but writers, important writers of their time, really took note of it. Ralph Waldo Emerson was definitely a huge fan. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who doesn't really get read very much anymore. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the British Romantic poet, and Oscar Wilde. Wow, what a great gang of people. So he immediately becomes seen as kind of a visionary, somebody pushing the form, pushing the genre where it hasn't been before. And he continues to barrel through and influence people in the 20th and 21st century. Hart Crane, an important American poet. Langston Hughes, who we'll be reading a little bit later on. Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet. Cherie Moraga, Kathy Acker, the 70s punk poet. And Pablo Neruda, the Nobel Prize winning Argentinian poet. So he is hugely influential. Now, just to compare him to somebody that's a little more traditional, hey, look, he's got my beard. We'll look at Henry Longfellow's poem Aftermath. Now, you can tell just by looking at it that this ain't Song of Myself. It's got a very predictable structure. It's going to have a very predictable meter, and it's also going to have a very strong rhyme scheme. So here's Aftermath. Now, when the summer fields are mown, when the birds are fledged and flown, and the dry leaves strew the path, with the falling of the snow, with the cawing of the crow, once again the fields we mow, and gather in the aftermath. Not the sweet new grass with flowers is this harvesting of ours, not the upland clover bloom, but the rowan mixed with weeds, tangled tufts from marsh and meads, where the poppy drops its seeds in the silence and the gloom. So this feels like a poem that comes out of a very, very long tradition of poems in English. Again, that very regular meter or rhythm, that very pronounced rhyme scheme, and also a very well tried and well trodden theme of nature and people's relationship to nature. Whitman also talks about nature a lot, but he really takes that idea of nature and pushes it farther. Here's another part of Walt Whitman's relationship, not only to literature, but to the business of literature, and his relationship between literature and readers is the frontispiece photo that he put into that very first version, published in Brooklyn, New York in 1855. Look at him right there. He's just standing there. He's got his hand on his hip, looking like a hipster. Now, looking at this, notice he's wearing workers' clothes. This could be somebody out working at the docks as a stevedore, or somebody moving barrels, or working as a carpenter, or working in the field baling hay. He's wearing a casual hat. It's cocked to the side, and even his look, he's staring at you, in a way that's somewhat confrontational, but also maybe inviting and alluring. This is a very different persona than what we saw with authors in the publishing industry before.